In order to understand the human dynamic of politics in the United States, or any country for that matter, you have to understand the array of political thought, what we refer to as political ideology. And what we're going to do right now is try to give you a basic understanding of the predominant political ideas that exist in the United States, political ideologies. We do this using a political spectrum. Political spectrums are used throughout various social sciences, and if you're a poli-sci major, you'll see many of these. Spectrums can be used to describe any number of attitudes or belief systems and so forth. So this is pretty much your basic left to right U.S. political spectrum that tries to provide to you the basic terms or ideologies or belief systems that exist out there within the political culture of the United States. Not just the elected political culture, although that's where we're going to be focusing a lot of our discussion, but in the country as a whole. If you go onto the internet and you just do a basic Google search, you will find any number of political spectrums. There are all types of advocates out there, people that have strong belief systems that develop their political spectrums and essentially try to explain the U.S. political system or the global political system using spectrums. And that's not wrong. It's just that you have to be careful because people have their own subjective viewpoints about what they think of these terms and these ideas and how a spectrum should be drawn. A lot of it is correct, some of it is incorrect, and some of it is not so much incorrect as it is that it needs further explanation because it might be drawn differently, and it is drawn differently necessarily than, for example, what you have in front of you. Spectrums are not just linear. They can be used in different formats. But this is pretty much, I think, the most direct way of explaining political ideology. One of the reasons this is so important is while you might not know what you believe in, and many people might not know what you believe, what it is they believe in, which I think it is important, obviously, to have some understanding of what you believe in and why. If you're going to understand a political system, at the minimum, you need to understand what other people believe in. Because if you turn on the television and you turn on the radio, you watch things on the internet, you'll have no idea, no basis from which to filter any of the information that is being thrown at you from strong-minded people on news, television shows, political shows, and so forth, if you don't have an understanding, a basic understanding of the various competing ideologies. Because, of course, when we get into the human understanding or the human dynamic of political ideologies, people assign a certain label to themselves, but of course they might cross over and manipulate their belief systems in a way that is not really consistent with what we would think in a academic setting a conservative, a liberal, social democracy is. In other words, people pretty much make up their own rules about what they believe in and why, but they are very, very comfortable calling themselves something even if how they act on that is not consistent with an academic understanding of those terms. So let's go ahead excuse me, and look, obviously this is the only chart we're going to be using throughout this discussion. And I'm going to break this discussion down into two parts because the political environment in the United States is largely, I'm going to draw a line here, is largely consisting of, let me get my pen going there actually, is largely centered around, using that term, the liberal, center, moderate, and conservative area here. Okay, there's all of these terms mean something because they're all used in the political dialogue in the United States. But this area that I just drew that orange line under, this is the center, the bulk of ideological thought in the United States. Now, the centerpiece of this spectrum, meaning center/moderate, right up here, that is not an ideology. Okay, that is just halfway between various ideologies. So if you're a centrist, or you're in the center, or you're a moderate, what we would likely conclude about you is that you have certain belief systems that you're conservative on, certain systems that you're liberal on, and so that means that you are not necessarily what we would say more ideological or ideologically driven, or an ideologue that is wedded, committed to one belief system purely. And that's not wrong, it's just how it is. Many people, many political scientists will tell you, and they're not wrong, that the bulk of American voters are in the middle here somewhere, because people do tend to have liberal and conservative viewpoints on multiple issues. And so in the current political environment, we know that we hear the term polarization, meaning there's not a lot of compromise. And there's a lot of truth to that, because there are certain strong beliefs coming from various ends of the spectrum that make it more difficult for the moderate element of the political culture to prevail. All right, so now that we know that center and moderate is not an ideology, let's just kind of continue on here. Now, before I get into liberal and conservative elements of political ideology and political culture, I want to go down here and I want you to look at the Democratic Party. I have this this line, this linear area here driven for the Democratic Party, and then one down here also for the Republican Party. And I have them extending themselves from here and here, and then of course from here and here respectively. If you just draw the line straight up, you'll see that essentially what I'm indicating here is that the Democratic Party runs the spectrum of, there's probably some social democrats in Congress and in the country that consider themselves, or that are members of the Democratic Party. There's liberal Democrats, there are center or moderate Democrats, centrist, and there clearly are conservative Democrats. And then, of course, we have the Republican Party that, if you take this line and you draw it straight up all the way up to the center-moderate area, generally speaking, the Republican Party covers the spectrum. There are centrist or moderate Republicans, conservative Republicans, and there are what we refer to as reactionary Republicans, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. There used to be, or it used to be said that there were liberal Republicans, and there might be people in the country that are liberal Republicans, but generally, not only in government, but in the country, liberal Republicans don't really exist anymore. And in fact, although I have the line for the Republican Party starting out at center and moderate, there are moderate centrist Republicans in the country, to be sure. There really are almost none left in Congress, if at all. So the bulk of the Republican Party is conservative or further right than conservative. Now, to be clear, political parties, just to be clear, some people will tell you otherwise, but make sure you are aware of this. Political parties are not ideologies. Political parties are not ideologies, even though we're talking about the political spectrum here. Be clear that they're not on that spectrum up here. I don't have them listed here. These are ideologies. Political parties are just that. They are political parties that are member-driven organizations. Member-driven organizations. Okay? They adopt political ideologies. So the Democratic Party and the Republican Party adopt ideologies. Remember that the Democratic Party has some social democrats, some liberals, they have some moderates and centrist, and they have some conservatives. So the Democratic Party has a bunch of different types of members in the party. And the Republican Party has essentially some moderates. We're getting crazy with the lines here. We have some conservatives and some reactionaries. Okay, so we can just kind of draw those lines down. I'm going to erase some of those lines just to get them out of the way for our discussion. Now, those realities make governing very difficult for the parties because they are always battling what their ideology of the party will be. So, for example, in the Healthcare Reform Act that was passed by the Democrats and President Obama, their biggest obstacle to achieving that goal really wasn't the Republican Party, although they were an obstacle. It was their own party, and that's because if you think of the Democrats as, Democrat, liberal, one and the same, you would be wrong, because there are many liberal Democrats, there are many centrist Democrats, and there are many conservative Democrats. And the conservative Democrats aligned themselves, much so, with the Republicans who were against the Healthcare Reform Act. And it's those conservative Democrats that President Obama and other moderate Democrats had to find a way to convince to vote in favor of that Healthcare Reform Act. And so parties are always redefining themselves throughout the generations based on, are there more conservatives, more moderates, more liberals, what have you, in the party. The Democratic Party used to be quite liberal. And although it's considered liberal now, and in some ways it is, there are many more moderates and conservatives than there used to be, at least over the last 30 or 40 years. And of course, parties had major transformations, or have had major transformations compared to, say, 100 years ago, for sure. Think about the Republican Party right now and the loss that they suffered in the recent 2012 presidential election. The Republican Party itself is involved in a battle between traditional conservatives and essentially the Tea Party conservative movement, which is considered more reactionary over here. Okay, just keep clear, or be clear, that political parties are not ideologies. They adopt ideologies by how many of which group of ideologically driven members are in their party ranks. Okay, all right. Now, over here, just so you know, we have left wing, and over here we have right wing, and those are terms that essentially refer to the political spectrum. There's a historical connection to them, but I won't get into that. But essentially, when people say left wing or right wing, they're talking about the political spectrum of ideology and thought. Okay. Now, when we talk about being a liberal in the United States, we are talking about someone who believes in government. They believe that government is a useful tool to solving social problems, economic problems. They believe government should be involved in regulating the economy. They believe government is a good way to help people that fall through the cracks of other systems, and that while they are not necessarily believing that government is the answer to everything, they are not afraid of government. They believe the government is an integral part of solving problems and having society evolve in a very progressive way. Hence the term progressives. Liberals are also known as progressives. And conservatives believe the opposite. It's not that they're against government. They believe, if we're talking about true conservative ideology, okay, right now we're not talking about necessarily people that call themselves conservatives and don't adhere to conservative philosophy in the traditional way. Conservatism generally means that you believe in the status quo. You believe in taking a very cautious approach. You believe in a very limited role of government because the more expansive powers that government has, conservatives believe that eventually it will lead to a lack of freedom, and that they believe the government should be only as big as necessary to protect its citizens from foreign and domestic insurrection and so forth, and threat, and of course provide some basic infrastructure elements and so forth. So we have two different belief systems about government, and at the heart of it in the United States, or really any country, if you wanted to find out what someone believed politically, you would be better off asking them what they think the proper role of government is versus what party do they belong to. If you ask someone what the proper role of government is in their opinion, and they tell you their answer reveals that they believe a very expansive role, then they're going to be over here on this part of the spectrum. If they believe that government should have a very limited role, then they're going to be over here in this part of the spectrum. If you ask someone what party do they belong to, then what we see is that you're going to learn something about them, but you're not really going to be clear because you're going to have to ask additional questions. They might say they're a Democrat, but you'll have no way of knowing, unless you know something about them already, if they are a liberal, centrist, or conservative Democrat. If you ask someone if they're a Republican, you're pretty much going to know they're a conservative. Why? Because the Republican Party is the conservative party in the United States. Most Western democracies have a party or parties that are conservative parties. In Great Britain, for example, the Tories, there's the Republican, it's the name for the conservative party there. The Republican Party in the United States is the conservative party. Now, there are different types of conservatism, which we'll get into in a minute. But when someone says they're Republican, you know they're conservative. To what degree? We have to find out. They might be a social conservative, a fiscal conservative, a neoconservative. They might be a Tea Party, Republican Party member, which makes them more reactionary. It's possible that, again, if we're talking about the public, they might be a moderate Republican. If we're talking about someone who's in power, generally speaking, right now, the Republicans are all conservatives. Okay. So we have this understanding that what the role of government is largely defines conservative and liberal. Up here at the very top, I have another line here, and I'm just drawing right there, this line right here, that runs all the way across here. Now, let me just get rid of that line real quick. That aspect of the chart is meant to inform you that from the liberal aspect over, from this aspect over, all the way over to fascism, this is where we really find capitalism, what is also known as classical liberalism, is in this area, and also people who believe in a liberal democracy versus a social democracy. So there are a lot of terms that are that exist in the political dialogue, and many of them belong on the political spectrum, and many of them are in addition to, or terms that refer to various aspects and belief systems that flow from the political spectrum itself and various ideological thought. So, to be clear, before we continue on with the discussion down here on the spectrum, capitalism is an economic system, and it believes that property largely should be held in the hands of private individuals, corporations, companies, that there should be private ownership of the resources of any country. The means of production should be privately held. Capitalism, supply and demand, competition, etc., etc. Classical liberalism is a term that I'm not necessarily going to test you on, but you need to be clear that if you were to take a political theory class, or you heard someone talk about classical liberalism or liberalism, you have to understand the context in which it's being discussed, because liberalism, classical liberalism is more in line with conservative, libertarian, pro-capitalist belief, okay? Whereas a U.S. liberal down here, a U.S. liberal right here, that is someone who believes not necessarily against capitalism, but they don't believe in capitalism as being unregulated. They believe that the government should be involved in regulation. There should be a strong government hand in controlling capitalism. And it is apart from what is known as classical liberalism. And classical liberalism is really the belief that there should be economic liberal belief and also democratic liberty or liberal belief. So classical liberalism breaks down into two sections or components, which is there should be a free market, and of course you should have political freedoms. Okay, and they believe those political freedoms should be individualized, liberal democracy, such as civil liberties and so forth, and that liberal democracy embodies not only political freedom, but of course economic freedom. Okay, and that is different than social democracy. It's not entirely different, but it is different, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So these areas, you can be a centrist and be a capitalist, you can be a liberal and be a capitalist, you can be a conservative and be a capitalist, and you can be a reactionary or a fascist and be practicing some degree of market economics. And you know, there's pure capitalism, and then there's market economics, how people implement it. And of course, classical liberalism, again, combines political and economic belief, and classical liberals are really in the area of conservative and reactionary elements, classical liberals. If you had to identify someone who was a classical liberalist, who believed in total political freedom and total economic freedom, we're really talking about the Libertarian Party, Ron Paul, pure ideological thought of freedom. Think of the term liberty, liberal, libertarian, liberalism. If we're talking about liberty, classical liberals, like libertarianism, believe that you should have total economic freedom and almost total, we should say, and almost total political freedom with some exception, obviously. That liberty, freedom as they defined it, is the most important component. Okay, so these various terms in some capacity or another cover this area of the spectrum. Okay, that's why I have those lines drawn the way they are. Okay, I'm just going to do some of my work there for clarity. Now, before we move on to some of the other terms and aspects of the political spectrum, I want to return to the discussion of the three primary areas of political thought in America, and that is the centerpiece of liberal, center/moderate, and conservative. And the reason I want to return there is because essentially the bulk of this discussion or this presentation is about accepted academic understandings, historical understandings of these terms. But then there's the reality of how well-known public figures and politicians and everyday citizens themselves somehow or another use these terms and use them loosely or use them in a way that is inconsistent with how they've governed or what positions they've taken. So, for example, if we take Ronald Reagan, an icon of the Republican Party, someone who is or had established conservative credentials in the eyes of many, which he did. But as President of the United States, we know that his strong beliefs were a very small government. And by the way, when we talk about conservatives believing in a small government, we're talking about not just the physical size of government, buildings and so forth, the amount of people that work for government, the amount of money that's devoted to government. We're talking about the amount of policy and laws that flow from government that give government power. So when we talk about small government, that's really what we're talking about. There's multiple aspects of it. Under Ronald Reagan, the size of government actually grew. It was larger than when he left office than when he took office. And that's largely because of the Pentagon budget. He built up the military budget, and it was very important for him to combat the Cold War. That was something very important to him and other conservatives. So he believed in small government. He believed in a strong military. He believed in low taxes. But that small government belief was very nuanced in the sense that certainly government, again, grew larger because his belief in challenging the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War and building up a strong military to negotiate from a position of power and so forth. But in doing that, we went into greater debt, and the size of the military, the Pentagon, was larger, which is a direct aspect of police power, and is what, quite frankly, many conservatives worry about, which is a sense of greater governmental power over our lives. So government became larger under Reagan, even though he is very much looked upon as someone who argued in favor of smaller government. What did shrink under Reagan's presidency was the size of social programs. Social programs, and I don't mean social conservative programs such as social moral issues that we've discussed before. I'm talking about welfare, education policy, healthcare assistance, and so forth. A lot of these things, these social welfare programs that the liberal aspect of U.S. government and the U.S. political spectrum believes in, shrank under Reagan. So what we're getting at here is that, just using Reagan as an example, government became larger, but the aspect of government that conservatives and Reagan did not like and favor became smaller. So when people say they like smaller government, for example, you have to understand, or you have to try and figure out, what do they specifically mean? Do they mean overall all of government, or do they mean certain aspects of government? And so that is a very important distinction to make, because just saying you believe in smaller government, it actually means you believe in a certain segment of government, social programs, the social welfare state that is advocated by liberals on the left side of the spectrum. So again, conservatives don't like involvement in the economy by the government in terms of regulation, but liberals and conservatives alike certainly like corporate welfare, subsidies, and loans and grants and assistance, financial assistance of the U.S. government to U.S. firms. That happens every year in this country in the billions. And conservatives do not mind government involvement in the economy in terms of assistance, which actually violates, on certain levels, free market principles in terms of social Darwinism and survival of the fittest and all of those types of things. However, they do not like the government involved in the economy in a regulatory fashion. Conservatives do like the government involved in law and order, and giving the government stronger police powers, stronger powers for the police to investigate, to break down your civil liberties for the greater good of protection of society, giving police agencies and investigative units more power and so forth. So they don't mind that type of government involvement. And liberals, they believe in capitalism, but they believe in regulating capitalism, but they don't like the government, quote unquote, in your bedroom. So liberals over here, they certainly want the government involved to regulate capitalism, but they don't want the government involved to tell you who you should marry, if you are allowed to choose an abortion or not, et cetera, et cetera. Conservatives don't want the government involved in regulating the economy, but they don't mind the government involved in terms of regulating moral behaviors, such as social conservative positions that I just mentioned. So both sides like the government involved in certain ways and not involved in other ways. Okay, it's a very important distinction to understand, that people choose to define these terms and choose to say they like small government or they like or do not like government involvement in certain very nuanced ways. Now, there is much more to get to, and the other aspects of the political ideological spectrum will be dealt with in the second or third part of the political spectrum video series.